want to be activists, they're just queer and that's that. But there are those who suffer, who take up the struggle. The question is queerness ontologically, a side of struggle, and is it always going to be like that? You can just...
I'm a stubborn optimist. So, and also I was lucky enough to experience and wake up to and find my calling inside of queerness in a deeply powerful way. So and also being a poet and a writer, words mean things deeply, and I struggle to think about a singular monolithic queerness in the same way that I think about a singular monolithic blackness. My blackness and my relationship to my queerness is mediated by many things, and something that I'm always going to bring to the fore is class. That I was born into an upper middle class black family who deeply invested in my education and gave a fuck about it deeply. And because of that, I was exposed and I had space and room to breathe in ways that so many queer people in this country do not have. So when you speak about choosing struggle, I think that also choice is a difficult word to signal, because how much of a choice really is it when things are so deeply stratified? We live in one of the most unequal places in the world, and I think that it's important to shine a light on that. As for queerness being a site of suffering, or ontologically speaking connected to suffering, oh hell no, absolutely not. My favorite Munoz quote is that queer people are standing on the roof of the sky even as it's falling, and that we are precipitating the sky falling. And I think that I like to think that we don't just stand on the roof of the sky as it's falling. We dance and we fuck and we love and we connect and we form families and chosen families, and we care for each other. We create communities, and we protect culture in a space in which we are told that our cultural products are not valuable, that we have this beautiful archive. And just the idea that picking up a camera and recording people being in space is important for future generations, for current generations. I think that there's a deep preciousness and joy and power in queerness that keeps me optimistic about it. Of course, pain, suffering, trauma is deeply connected to it, but like Bev was saying, that we should point our fingers where we need to point our fingers, that it's not queerness that is suffering, but it's a system that ensures that queer people suffer. It's not us, it's not part of us, it has nothing to do with us.
So I'm still negotiating my, I'm not sure I was meant to perch, so I'm like, so I was thinking my favorite part of Simon and I's is watching, and Bev was talking about not being courageous, and I'm like, oh my goodness, like for you to, like, across those ages, that there's a kind of the way that you're so joyful or claiming, like laughing and dancing, and I'm just like, and for me the joy of watching that is every time I'm like, oh, that's the part, like the goofy, funny person who has their childhood, because I find that there's something very it touches something sore inside me, actually, to think about that, like across those times there's this joyfulness, and I think that's and I think it's because that's tied to my interest in, like, actually girlhood. How I started to think and do research was thinking about my own feeling of confinement, and being sort of being feminized as a kind of social practice, and then being very interested in these confines. But also then I'm thinking, like, how do you have all this video to make this film? And it's also like, well, also part of the method of being girled is also you collect things, you hoard things, and of course there's these natural methods of archiving that are just part of this technology of confinement that are also enabling, or they produce conditions of enablement or capacities that I think are also another point of entry into thinking about what I'm framing as confinement. So I'm less optimistic. I think I'm so optimistic that I'm deeply pessimistic. And so for me, I don't believe in progress time. You know that thing you're taught at school where you, at the end of your essay, be like, everything's really shit, but it'll be better next time. And every time someone sends me an essay like that, I'm like, no, it will not. Can you revise this aspect of your thinking? But I think for me, then it becomes, what are the forms, what are our capacities under conditions where we do not try to reconcile loss, where we kind of rest with those forms of loss and as forms of capacity in certain kinds of ways, and they produce different kinds of routes that are not contaminated with progress time, with like, things will be better in the future. Never in history has that been the case. So for me, it's like, what is, it's a different kind of orientation, I think, that's deeply, deeply pessimistic. Yeah, but loving. Yeah.
Maneo, you spoke about the state, and you also invoked capitalism, just in terms of how it co-opts narratives, our narratives, Now, when it comes to the state, I would like you, and also the everyday, right? People, our mothers, our fathers, the community where we grew up. I want you to speak to the production of the undead, and I'll articulate that in a moment, where you exist, you are a human being, but you're, by virtue of being queer, right? And also how people use articulations of what they think is queer. Like, so if you are a feminine boy growing up, without even knowing queerness, there's an exertion of violence already towards that. In what ways does the state today produce that, that condition, like that you are a human being? We know social death, right? But these people who walk around, they are not dead, they're physically there, but their lives are so stalled that you can't explore teenagehood, queer teenagehood, possibilities that lie there. As a child coming up, you only get to come out, maybe even the idea of coming out, you get to explore queerness in your 30s, but you never lived your life, in as much as people might think that you were alive, right? You lived, you died, but you never lived the life you desired. How does the state produce the undead? And that's the categorization that I would like to use, or that I tend to use, that we walk around, we are queer, but we're not fully the kinds of people we would like to become.
This one? Oh, this one?
Yeah.
1, 2. Oh, yeah. I think it's a difficult question for so many reasons. I think because we're people, and it's difficult to theorize your own death, your own social death, your own undeath, if that, unliving. And it's an idea that I've been trying and failing to explore in the idea of untheir. You know what I mean? There was this one quote from some book in the States where I believe the main character goes back to their hometown and it's been demolished. And the phrase that was used is, there is no there. And I think later on, George Bush, the lesser, used a similar phrase about the war, I believe. I may be entirely wrong. But it's interesting, the way that you frame the question as well, it's to embody queerness as a kind of life, a kind of social death. And I think from watching the film as well, queerness is not something that we wake up desiring. You know what I mean? It's not like, I wake up in the morning and I'm like, I want to be othered. I want to be a kind of social death that life draws from to justify its own morality. I think that queerness is a protest, as we've seen as well from the film. It is an ongoing protest for life. It's a paradox at the same time, in the sense that we adopt this monocle, we embody being other, You know what I mean? Consciously knowing that the way that the state has produced life, bios, is in such a way that it excludes us. And then to adopt that in celebration, in protest, in radical joy, you know, is precarious, you know? It's such a precarious state to exist in. And I loved what Maneo was saying as well, this idea that we can't afford not to be hopeful. You know what I mean? We can't afford pessimism. We are, you know what I mean? And all of that. But I'm seeing you smiling, and I'm so curious. But I suppose to come to your question more specifically, more directly, I think the state produces death and queerness by centering cisgender heterosexual identity making. It does in many ways as well, from, you know, birth certificates to the kinds of stories and narratives that we exist in, by producing kind of, you know, a Huber nuclear family situation as, you know, the primary unit of the state. And in so doing, through exclusion, says that there is no there in queerness. They don't exist. It's un-African, it's European, it's, you know, USA and whatnot. I think those are the ways in which the state, the family unit, the school, you know, single-sex schools is a very weird thing. And my sense is that if they didn't exist and they're proposed now, it'd be a wild constitutional fight. But, you know what I mean? So yeah, I think those are the metrics and the paradoxes that exist in your question as well.
Yeah, you know, you kind of spoke to the state, but also the ways in which the state functions. So the education system, we saw a couple of months ago, you know, the rejection of the policy reforms, particularly in terms of teaching children about sex, but also in a particular way. The assumption is that, well, how dare you teach children about these things? You know, ACDP was one of organizations that really pushed that and said, no, we're not going to accept this. But Deputy Minister, what then is the responsible of policy today? I mean, I know that, you know, with when we look at Bev and Simon and people who lived at the time, there are kind of small victories that they won. But if you look at the legislation and the protections that exist in the Constitution, there's a huge disjuncture between the everyday experiences and what exists in the law. That our experiences does not necessarily, something is misaligned. In what ways is the law useful, and those changes, pushing those changes legislatively to ensure that we meet that, you know, that difference that currently exists?
Okay, I hope I've got the question. Look, I think also just referring to the movie and to Bev's experiences, that one of the having the right to equality and the right not to be discriminated against on the basis of your sexual orientation in the Constitution, as I think Bev, or was it Edwin Cameron in the movie, had said that was the first country in the world to have that. Now there are 9, I think. And so the law flowed out of that. Whether it was legal reform coming from Parliament, whether it was court cases from the Constitutional Court. So the situation then we are in is, if anybody feels discriminated against on the basis of their sexual orientation or gender identity, they can then go to court, an equality court, first of all, to take that up. I think generally the law has, most of the legal reforms have been done. I think there's still an issue on a hate crimes and hate speech bill, which is a bit stuck in Parliament waiting for the outcome of the Kwelane judgment. Then there's legal reform needed for intersex and transgender people. And that's largely it. The main problem, though, is the implementation. And one thing where I disagree with Kneo is I think the state is changing. Society is changing. So what you would have seen from that movie is attitudes then have improved things have improved now. Definitely those of us who were around then can attest to that. Those of you who weren't will just have to read about it or whatever. But for example, Parliament is passing the first non-gender bill or act, which is the cybercrimes bill. It's finishing its passage in the first week of December. And it is specifically non-gender in terms of no he's or she's. That's a small issue. But I don't know if I've got any, can I do another plug? Just, my time problem.
Yes, but I think I see that there's a disagreement, or kind of like a rebuttal of what you were saying in terms of this, what happened then and the fact that you were there and the experience today. So I would like you to afford us an opportunity to come back to that, but you can continue.
No, the point I made, and sorry, I've just got another engagement webinar that I'm doing on the Protection of Personal Information Act, and so I have to connect up to that pretty soon. No, the point I wanted to make is I think it was also something that Bev said, and the need for continued activism. And, the laws may be there in terms of this is what you're entitled to. The people who implement those laws may not give you what they want or may not do what they're meant to do. You need to keep struggling on that. So I'm not sure why I'm getting the expressions from you. Okay, it's a bit off-putting, but anyway. So I just wanted to make that point in case I don't have a chance to speak anymore after this.
Okay, Maneo, do you want to respond to that?
Why is it me? I guess I just have a very expressive face, but I think the thing that I'm thinking about is the ways in which the state and laws, and actually, let me just order my thoughts first. Specifically around the hate crimes bill, because I remember doing a lot of work, and I was lucky enough to do quite a bit of community activism and advocacy around that. And the problem that we kept rubbing up against is the carceral, the deeply carceral nature in the ways in which even when we try and protect queer people in this country, we are still running up against a longer legacy of deeply carceral empire. So who it is that we're putting in prison and what happens once they are sent off to prison. And prison more now because of the scholarship and more that abolition and abolitionism is kind of coming back into the mainstream in just in the way that we talk about it, and I'm very grateful for that, because it is such a long history of theory and work and activism and praxis. But in thinking very, very seriously about prisons as a site of the reproduction of violence, because a lot of the time, very violent men are then sent to prison and come out more violent. And we have to think about that very seriously. And we have to really think about what happens, what protection means, what justice means, what freedom means, what safety means. And I think that there's a deep tension between the law and lived experience, even though I'm so bored with the word lived experience, but it's true. Like there's a deep tension there that I think that it's only going to get more tense if it is left unaddressed about the long carceral history of this country.
I think I hear the point that you're making. I think that, the state is making laws, and there is progress. It's progress that has been made by activists, progress that has been made by people we have put in parliament and the legislature. There is progress. But I also have a law degree, and I understand how the law approaches these kinds of problems. And for me, it has always been the foundational theory that the law tries to approach queerness and LGBTIQA plus, queer ideas, freedoms, legislation. It appears to me that the state has a theory of what the body means and what the body is. And it's a theory that doesn't necessarily you know what I mean, cooperate with lived experiences. But at the same time, there are people within the queer community that also operate from the same position as well. You know, like the phrase lived experiences kind of says, this is my body and this is how I live it and this is the experience that I have. And it's a very corporeal, it's a very visceral, it's a very, you know, look under the skirt kind of way of addressing what does gender mean, you know? So if you have this body, then you may, you know, then you are this thing. There is an act as well that allows you to have the gender assignment on your ID changed, but you have to have transitioned. You know what I mean? And it's you have to have undergone gender affirming surgery.
You've got to wait 2 years. I mean, that's one of the laws that I'd earmarked as saying needs to be changed. But currently the law is you can change your gender identity. I think you've got to wait 2 years, and you've got to have, which is problematic, yes, and which you've got to, you don't have to undergo the surgery, but you've got to have a medical report, I think, or 2 medical reports that you're intending to change, but you don't have to undergo the surgery. But that's one of the laws that needs to be changed, and that needs to be changed in conjunction with transgender people. So
I hear you, but you've also cut me off. And I think that's one of the problems, right? What do we mean by gender? What do we mean by sex? There are so many forms in this world that confuse the two. And when I am participating in those forms in this system, every time there's this conflation between the two, when there is no, you know what I mean? The way that the state kind of seems to understand. I think even UCT has a weird way of putting it. It says, you know, I think it says sex or gender, but it says male, female, or transgender. You know what I mean? The ideas in which the state is built on are borrowed from other places, do not speak to who we are, and it tries to kind of very in a binary, very kind of classification, hard, rigid, clear cut, clean kind of way. And gender isn't that. And sexuality isn't that. Identity isn't that.
Just before we come to it, can we get one more question from the audience before the deputy? Okay, it's fine. He has to go. But do you have a question from the audience? I'll come to you after.
It's just.
Thank you very much.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, it's a comment. Well, the state is useless. He can leave. It's fine. What I just wanted to say was, coronavirus. It's very sad to have conversations about queerness and the state. One, particularly when there are smart people on the panel, because like ideas just get thrown out in and out. But I just wanted to say, it's a comment, also not a question, again. This idea of the contestation between optimism and pessimism in our activism is very, I think it's at the brink of what we would call ethics. Like, we can't decide on our ethics because we're fighting about whether we're optimistic or pessimistic. And like, when we talk about it relating to queerness, then everything just becomes sad, worse, and more pessimistic, and like, it just becomes worse. So I just wanted to say, I guess I appreciated seeing it live. Not just reading about it and like telling people that, I wish I could see pessimists and optimists fighting, but it was nice to see it.
Okay, does anyone have a comment before we go to Dr. Danai?
Thank you. I just wanted to acknowledge this moment of kind of rejection. I don't know, that just, I'm sure the whole room feels. And I want to reflect on a recent interaction with the state that we just had as a group of queer activists. We went to an event called the Shelter in Ndaba that was organized by the Department of Social Development. And there was a presentation by SAPS, one of the head people at SAPS. And in this presentation, they had a list of vulnerable groups that supposedly, according to them, need shelter. We didn't make the list. So I would like to know if we exist to the state. I would like to know if we exist to the police. And I want to also understand, when is it convenient to interact with us, and can we have a little bit more time? With that, you, as someone who's, kind of facilitating this, you live it and you let the audience take it for what it is, because it's here, it's playing out, and we see it. So I didn't want to make a comment because we lived it, Dr. Danai?
Yeah, there was so much going on that requires a deep engagement, because I was like, there was so much going on. Like, I was like, ooh, let me just clean your chakra also on your way out, because you're going through a lot. Okay, yeah. So yeah, the conversation we're having about justice, because I was in the state, and I think also, because I think there's lots of gains around the legal person that are important, but I think the trouble is that a lot of our conceptions of freedom have been tied to that legal notion of personhood, and it's foundationally tied to the appropriation of land and other species and other things, and a property relation. And I think that the conditions of freedom that we then have to compromise with, where we think of ourselves as our own property, are very compromised, because one, they don't necessarily speak to where we get our sense of justice, where it first begins to articulate itself, but two, it means that the relations we have to the world and ourselves that are not bound to the individual are very, then we're just very incompetent at thinking of ourselves as people who rely on each other, as in we're not it's that notion of freedom is so confined that our incapacity actually as individuals is not something we can contend with, and so it just becomes this site of and I think that's tied to this the comment Bev was making about call out culture. In the sense that a lot of the stuff that we're not articulate to do, because it's easy to be like, you're pointing to my pain, but it's not easy to be like, what is the nature of my pain? And so there's a lot of stuff that I think is really difficult to think about in terms of justice and freedom, that even the ways that you intuitively might have been taught to think of the self in relation to others always, that those habits become less and less habitual, because now there's this contamination of the individual subject of the law as freedom, and any other capacity for justice seems like you're imagining something from Mars, when in fact you might have already spoken a language that told you a sense of justice that didn't rely on that notion of that person. And I think it's also the impoverished education we have. People, you get shocked now, you know nothing in the world, but you've had 25 years of education telling you can't think for yourself. So why are we surprised people can't think for themselves? Sorry, I didn't mean to become Pastor D, but it happened. Maybe it was the chakra cleanse that was simultaneously going on.
Yeah,
it's okay.
I wanna jump on this, because this is so. I mean, in that moment, like an elder of mine, like my grandmother or someone would say, like Mutoa Nabutu, like doesn't have that thing, and didn't engage with us in that space. And I think that connects very deeply to what you're saying, Danai, about that we have been so deeply alienated and like floating from our own deep knowledge. And I think this is also a problem of language, that even now, even the ways in which we articulate ourselves with our, $10 million English, that it's that we, one of my favorite but also most painful poems was arose out of the experience of trying to explain myself to my grandmother, of trying to introduce myself to someone who raised me in language that is always already going to leave us deeply estranged from each other. So how can I be like Nkgono, I'm a like polyamorous, demi-gender, non-binary, like that space. But I found community and deep knowing in that language. But there is a chasm of identity in that, and there's also a current of power in that from the global north, knowledge forms, trickles down, rains upon us, and is applied. But also one of my favorite artists and activists, Jota Mombasha, did this like embodied way of sticking out their tongue and trying to say the word queer. And it's like, that as a demonstration that this word queer doesn't fit in my mouth. I have words for myself. I have an understanding of myself that's ancestral, that's much longer. But more than that being a deeply personal affirmation and a powerful way of inscribing identity in space, that it's a political, like a deeply political rejection to say, though, just because you have language for how you understand me doesn't mean that I don't understand myself in different ways. And that then translates into our ideas of justice and freedom, and yeah.
Do you want to say something? What can I ask? Do you have a question? If not, I can ask. Is that fine? Okay. There's one at the back. I can't see it.
Thank you. I try not to comment because I feel like I've already had kind of my moment and everybody else needs to engage, but I just can't get over and can't get past the fact that we were told that things are better for us than they were back then, and that we couldn't even challenge that because of the fact that there was like such violence to that, because then it speaks to the erasure that Genevieve was just mentioning now. The reason why we don't exist as a vulnerable group is because there's already a perception that things are better for us. And I don't know how. We have people in the Human Rights Commission sitting in this space. I would like for us to just please challenge that. I don't know at this point how we would do it, but I'm sitting so disturbed by that, just because I am now in some middle class kind of space where I drive to get here, and that I live in a suburb where I am relatively safer than my queer people everywhere around me who are not in a suburb, who take public transport, who are walking around expecting violation every second of every day of their lives. I just find that statement so violent. I'm feeling violated by our own deputy minister. I would like us to challenge that.
So just before anyone, it's been open to engage that. We engaging experiencing COVID, and one of the clear indications of just the violence and the precarity that queer people experience or encounter is when the university closes and people have to go home, having to go back to spaces that really perpetually tell them that they're not worthy. They shouldn't speak like that. They shouldn't walk like that. And the idea that things are better is really discounted by that, what we've just encountered. The fact that some people have had to go back home where they don't feel safe, where they have to now try to re-embody the condition of unfreedom that before you left home for varsity, you were this person who couldn't be free. You couldn't experience friendship. You are now separated from your friends who might be located in the city. And I'm not saying that the city is a safe space or that the university is a safe space. There are issues, right? But when someone says that things are better, and we contrast that with the inequality that exists in South Africa, the landlessness that exists in South Africa, the violence that is targeted at women and children and all vulnerable groups who are also queer. What does it mean then for things to be better now, right? So to me, in as much as I'm supposed to facilitate this conversation, I mean, you heard earlier that the deputy minister said I was frowning or something, and I was, because I should, right? Because it doesn't make sense for someone to say that, things are better for you now, because they're not. So yeah, I just want to make that clear, because, it's something that he said earlier that I'm frowning, and I was, and I don't apologize for it.
And I think the other thing for me was how it appeared to me that we all kind of panicked. Like, but what do, you know what I mean? Just, we don't know what to do, what to say, how to say it. What? And I think the other thing as well is also the politics of shock. You know what I mean? I think sometimes it's not new to be treated like by the state. I keep pointing at you, that is, or you him. It's not new to be treated by the state in that way, this idea that you're not real, that you should be grateful, that you can come here, that you have nothing to worry about, that no, but there are so many other things that are so much better. And then not have words, try to lean back on the academy. The academy fails you. You're missing the audience. No one, what, you know what I mean? And to be shocked every time is a kind of protest itself as well. That you know what the state has in mind for you or doesn't have in mind for you. And you know what it means to be violated by the state, by your family, by your school, by the society. And to be shocked every time feels boring, but it's powerful, because what you're saying is that this is not normal. This is not okay. It's a labor, you know what I mean? To bring that out of you every time and not to let it walk past and walk off, but to say, whoa, what the hell was that? Is yeah, I don't know.
Can I just say something a little bit petty? Also, the man was going through a lot because of our English. He was going through a lot. So I was just like, oh, honey, you're going through so much. You know? Sorry, it's not...
I think also I'd like to kind of also bring to the, because also, you know, like that thing that happens where you're just like, oh my gosh, that actually happened, and I'm still like processing as I'm sitting up here. But like the dismissal, the casual dismissal of saying I have somewhere better to be. Yeah, and I'm gonna tell you about it, and then I'm gonna bounce like that.
Who carries a laptop?
And also another thing. Thank you so much for bringing Petty in this space, because now, the deep protectiveness of telling us, Oguti, just because you weren't there, for those of you that weren't there, that, okay, fine, I understand that, but to bring out my youth in that deep dismissive way, as if the function of queer community isn't at its very basis, it's written, weaved into it, deeply intergenerational, that we are deeply in contact with our elders. Futek, actually, wow, I'm mad, and like, Yeah, wow. And I'm going to kind of speak about the sacredness of shock, and that shock and rage are deeply sacred. That they it's love in a different way. It's showing you what you deserve, and something that I tell all the people that I love, that your rage is sacred. Not everybody deserves it. That I'm sitting in that thing to be like, I'm very glad that also that we're angry with each other here, because they don't deserve my shock and my rage right now, even though I'm definitely pointing my arrows at the Capitol, but like
is there a question? Okay, there's a question at the back. Okay, we'll go to the back. It's fine. Can we? No, we can start with you. It's okay.
Me.
Yes.
I guess it's less of a question and more of, I guess it is a question, but a bit of an existential one. But the moment we all just experienced, I'm sorry, Corona, was just so bizarre, because he felt so easily entitled to say, but you weren't there. But you don't have to wait 2 years. And we have to now, a whole group of people, we're a whole fucking room of people, politely be like, so actually, yeah, I know I wasn't there in apartheid, but I very much fucking know that my dad had to like stab a kid when he was 4 to not have to join a gang. Like, I know the violence of apartheid. I didn't have to be there to do that. But then we're all politely sitting here being like, so what I think I was trying to articulate was, when he can be like, it's 2:15, I'm very upset, I'm gonna miss my webinar. And I think I'm just frustrated and angry, because yes, we shouldn't cancel people, but it's also so fucking exhausting to have to sit here politely and have to engage with people who created these fucking bizarre boxes that I'm sure they don't even fit into, who they now so violently defend when people saying like, hey dude, I might have 2 tits and a vagina, but I'm not a woman. Like, what more do I need to say to you for you to listen to me and even just try and understand where I'm coming from? Because you can just so easily be like, my webinar. But people have come together from different walks of life, different experiences, to say like, hey, we exist. Can we have a chat? And it's, I guess I'm just like flabbergasted at how much we have to go through to just be heard, when we clearly have an experience that is happening, and for people to go, but apartheid was bad, but like it's not there anymore, so you should be happy. I think I'm just like, I don't know. Yeah. My question was, how do we not cancel but still exist, but knowing that we have to beg for scraps to try and change one cyber law regulation to not be gendered, when you can just go Command A, delete he and she, replace it with they or one. I'm not going to clap for that. Sorry.
Yes, question at the back. We'll come back to you.
Which back?
Oh, me. Sorry.
Yes.
Can you hear me? No? How about now?
Yes.
Okay. I think we just experienced the personification of white male patriarchy. He holds a public office and we are not public enough. And I know that everyone keeps saying this, but like, why are we niche? Why do we have to be niche when it is your job to be here? I'm genuinely offended by this. Like, I feel like, did anyone get the answers they needed about their safety during Corona, when we know that the crime rates are spiking in the country? Does anybody know which numbers to call if you are oppressed or targeted specifically because you don't identify on the binary? His only job was to give us that information above anything else. What do we do to get the justice that we need in this country? And this is how our government treats us. This is how the public sector treats us, and it's not good enough. It's really not good enough to walk out of here when someone says, I am directly talking to you as the state. You look back, you acknowledge that I am seeing you, person, speaking to me, and then you still walk out. I don't know, it's not a question, but it's not good enough that we are sitting here, because if we know this and we know that the shock is, but at some point enough needs to be enough, and we need to say, screw it. You don't move until we get the answers we need. Yeah, we are being held hostage by the state. We can't do anything. We have to be home when the sun goes down, because it is not safer. We can't go to groove. We talk about groove, but guys, we don't know what it means to party safely. We don't. So I don't know, whoever is out there, whoever reports to him, whoever gives him his what, that media report where you are now like your performance review. If this is what you do in a space where there are less than 50 people, you suck. You suck. You cannot hold, you are not worthy to lead millions in this country, because you can't. We have just experienced the violence that white males perpetuate constantly, and we let him move because we've been programmed and conditioned to accept that the father has spoken. Yeah. And therefore we don't challenge our father.
Yeah. Yeah. I held a mic for him.
You like? No, and it's not even your fault. He expected it. That's the worst part, is that he knew it would happen. He expected it. Our father spoke and our father left, just like our father always does. Where is he when we need the answers? You are here to tell us about all the wins, but they're not wins for me. I don't get to go and change my gender marker on my ID. And it's not, I've been socially transitioned my entire life. But I have to wait 2 years for some doctor to deem me medically unwell mentally. And it's not for any other reason, but because I do not identify with the gender marker they gave me. And then he left. And that's that. So who do we turn to protect us? Where is the justice when the Department of Justice couldn't hold space in a space where they're supposed to be? God, sorry.
Thank you.
I've just been kind of reflecting a lot on, part of the challenge of being in civil society, and I think it kind of hinges on this, because on the one hand, we can't get anywhere without working with government, attending a shelter in Ndaba where there's such violence against you as a person, and perhaps that's why it's also quite exhausting. And then I think about my colleagues, particularly in Triangle Project in gender dynamics, and the importance of acknowledging that, like, a lot of the shifts that have happened post 1994 in South Africa has really been incremental. And I know in civil society we like small wins are big wins, right? Because what else are we supposed to do? But it's the tireless work of people in civil, and maybe that's why we're just like exhausted, because it's a fight. But it's so difficult to balance that, because at the end of the day, like, I mean, it's going to sound crazy to say this, but like the deputy minister is actually one of the good people in government that we've engaged with, in the sense of like, like acknowledging why gender markers are important and all of that. That's the dilemma. It's like, and the frustration often then is like when there's such a level of violence, that it almost makes your work like inane. It makes it like pointless, and having to I don't know, deal with that is it's exhausting. It really is.
I hear you, Kevo.
Yeah.
I really do. Hectically, sorry, I just want to love up on Kevo and also love up on this amazing person and the rage that you filled the space with. Thank you. That it should not go unacknowledged. I also want to kind of speak about progress. Like, I always think about this thing that Malcolm X says, but Malcolm X says that you can't stick a knife into my back and then pull it out 3 inches and call it progress. It's still in my back. It still hurts. And yet, in order for that, the incremental, the small wins, that I I can't imagine, while also deeply imagining, because I was inside civil society spaces, that to know that exhaustion and the bureaucracy and the red tape, and to be deeply in such proximity with that kind of violence all the time, while always having to keep community and people that don't have space to advocate for themselves and aren't given space to advocate for themselves. So you have to do so much work. So I also want to acknowledge that work, while also acknowledging the kind of like awful, when your head hits the pillow, like, what the fuck is the point of this work? I'm sure that there's deep exhaustion in that. Like, I want to bring that into the room and also like hold you in that too.
We have a question in the back.
So thank you for the opportunity. I'm not really sure why we're shocked. I find that confusing because, I mean, we saw it from the film where you had people trying to fight for our rights, and we had other protesters who were saying that we were a sin, we're going to hell, we're going to burn, stuff like that. And for me, what he symbolized was those protesters. And as long as we still have those protesters making decisions on our behalf, we cannot expect change. We cannot expect that things will be different if people who are sitting in a room trying to decide whether or not you should identify as male or female or as none are identifying as cisgender. They won't understand your struggle. They won't understand why you cannot identify as male or female. As long as we're not in those spaces, we're not putting ourselves in those positions, in those roles, there will be no change. They'll keep feeling like they're doing us a favor. Because what he thought was, I mean, you should be thankful that we gave you an opportunity to even be sitting here. That was the message. That's why he was so dismissive. That's why when the person in front of me reacted, he stopped and got very angry. And I could see that had we not been a group, this person would have been attacked in this very moment in front of us. But you know, and it's happening everywhere. It's happening in all spheres of life. It happens in corporate. We see it happening all the time. We saw the Ivy Park line getting released saying it's gender non-conforming, and they say click on this link and you know get an update the minute it gets released. The first question they asked was, are you male or female? The first question, saying this is a non-binary clothing line, but the question that they ask, they want to know before you can subscribe is, are you male or female? Because it was a couple of cis people thinking, by just saying that this is a non-gender conforming line, it makes it okay to attract that type of, you know, demographic. But it's not realistic. So we need to also put ourselves in these roles, not just be activists, take action, be the next justice. Do what needs to be done to change these legislations. We cannot expect straight people to change and make changes for the queer community. It has to be us doing the change.
Thank you for that. Can we, yes?
Sorry, just like I know there's a million comments, but I just think it's very telling that Bev speaks to the failures of our freedom, where we aren't really free because of the freedoms we've been given, how we're so backwards today. And then he comes in here, an outsider in the space, and tells us that it is better. And I think while acknowledging you know, that the energy that was in the room when he was here, I think it's also very important to acknowledge the feeling that we have felt now in this discussion, where I think that is so integral to the queer experience, that we are coming together and we're angry about that.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to have to release Kneo. They have to go and fetch their baby sister at school. So I need to note that they're not going to walk off. It won't be a walk off. But I don't know if you have a last word. But, you know, But thank you for being here. Thank you very much.
I wanted to thank you. Thank you for holding this space for everybody who was involved in convening it. Thank you for everybody's vulnerability and honesty. And it's been, interestingly enough, a strangely revitalizing moment for me. You know what I mean? Kind of finding ground again, finding energy again. So I wanted to thank everybody for coming. Thank you so much to Bev. Oh my goodness. But yeah, so thank you. I'm going to be on my way then, if that's all right. Cool.
So we're not far from closing, but I want to acknowledge the fact that when things like this happen, they also derail us from what we would have kind of intended for the space to be like. I mean, Toni Morrison speaks to racism and how destructive it is, but also I also think that we can also apply the same logic to encounters like this and how destructive they are to what we may have intended the space to be like, which is why I want us to address maybe this question around, we were engaged in the state, and it seems like when we say the state, there's a sense of community, a collective that we, from which we speak. We are queer and we are engaged in the state. But I want us to go deeper into the idea of the community, us, and some of the ways in which we contribute to the disjuncture that exists within us as a community. Also the question of community, because community has certain particular meanings attached to it. Is it truly a community? Because I think it's fundamental that the idea of constructing a space that has essentially defining principles, what is right, what is wrong, what holds together the community, enables us to move forward and even be able to engage the state to say that this is wrong, and we speak as a collective, as opposed to speaking with people or as people who have different ideas, but think that they are holding a collective, a singular idea of what is it that we are unhappy about. Can you kindly speak to that?
I hope so. I have two things in my mind. The first is about like the registers or strategies we use to approach, because I don't know if there's ever going to be so that because there are so many angles, or that there's got to be a kind of code switching constantly in terms of strategy and method, and I think that requires, I guess, different kinds of community, or so if I'm engaging strategically in this way, it might require a different way or frame of community to get an action done. And so I think that kind of to be multilingual, let's go back to the to have multiple strategies and register will mean different forms of community, because there's different forms of action, and I may not be so there may be frames that of connection that enable a form of community and action between us in this moment or strategy that doesn't apply or would be illegible in another set of conditions or relations. Another thing I was thinking when I saw is it Uncle Father Mugabe on the TV, and I was just thinking how, because that visceral moment when he's like, there's a way that in my mind I'd gotten over, like, been like, you're just having a lot of, Banana broke up with you, then you got really angry, and then you acted in a really bad way, and but also to be like, oh, but you're also really dangerous. I know you were heartbroken and you misbehaved, but then you became dangerous. But also I think because of the ways I grew up, there were so many forms of community that seem natural, like the state, or to some people. Like I grew up around people who love the state and are very nationalistic and xenophobically so, as many of us probably really grow up. And it was never the intuition I had, because I was always like, this makes no damn sense, because it's such a violent condition of relation. So, but it leaves you with a deep sense of loneliness. I wish I was like stupid enough to be like, I'm happy in the nation, because sound like I'm being mean, but it's almost like a happy life, you know? You believe you belong somewhere and people love you inherently because you love them on the basis of things that are very wrong. And people live that way and they live in harmful ways. You know, it's like I study female friendship as a thing. And you're like, the way it's like a very cruel structure, you know, you're mean to each other on purpose. My daughter was telling me at school, she's like, I got tea. Someone was pretending that she was making a joke about being toxic. They're like 11. So she's joking about being toxic and the other person sees it as an opportunity to get in by being rude to the other one because that's the way you get in. And I mean, that structure of belonging is, I think, familiar. No, I'm not crazy, right? And so the alternative then is like a deep loneliness, I think, at least the way I feel it and experience it. But then that one, I don't want that one. So I think it's hard to acknowledge deep loneliness as a real thing in the world that we're all negotiating in some ways. Which leads me to my final thing that I think is interesting in how the conversation has as we've been going in terms of one of the things that I think is also part of this deep loneliness is the difficulty across generations around these conversations around power in general. And I've always thought that I sit between generations. I'm a Zennial. And so like when the Generation X's are like, these young people, I'm like, oh, okay, shame. And then millennials like, oh, we like avocado toast. Sorry, this just Facebook told me this. I'm like, I do too. And so I feel like I'm multilingual, in those ways, And so I'm always like, oh, I think you could be more. And then people think it's a magical skill I have, or like I went to some kind of school, because I'm like, I wonder if you thought about this way. Then they're like, oh, she speaks millennial. And I'm like, oh, I wonder if you, And I wonder, because people don't know how to deal with difference or with conflict in the main. So I'm feeling, and I think what happens often is that we then think we all have to think and feel the same way. And if we don't think and feel the same way, then we are not woke or acting or. So woke here, but on this way, I guess it's like, you have no politics as the Generation X's, and these ones are like, you're not woke. So me in the middle speaking both. And I think that a lot of the times the fear of your own gut telling you something that is your own, and the fear of articulating it is rooted in that ongoing loneliness that all of us are breathing through all the time. That then our capacity to actually put things on the table that may mobilize a different range of ways of seeing each other, engaging each other, but doing politics is put aside because the risk of being alone is so much and no one is going to name it that. And then we're just, so that's just, I don't know. I went corner 5 times, but yeah.
Going to say the thing that you're also saying the thing. I think I'm experiencing and watching Bev's film, I was experiencing a deep form of grief watching people dance. Like, I don't know if you feel that, like, just like that thing now that, because we haven't been able to gather in flesh terms, that I'm sensing a deep loss and a political loss in that too. That community is, I was watching the Matrix yesterday, and like there's this line that I love so much that the Oracle says to Kneo, where she says, being the one is like being in love. Like no one can tell you that you're in love, you just know it. And I think community is like that too, that it's very difficult to explain community, but it's a buzzword in the kind of neoliberal queer sort of establishment that we're finding ourselves in, that has only been made more apparent by the digitization of community, and even more so now because we can't gather in flesh terms, and community is formed on the sweaty dance floor when you make out with someone that you were like, I've been eyeing you 4 weeks, and that happens, and they introduce you to a space, and then that person introduces you to a living room, and then you have a conversation for the very first time, and you hear the word non-binary, and it sounds like gospel. You're like, oh wait, there's a word? What? and it happened because you made out with a cutie on a dance floor at Kitcheners. And I think that, like, it's true. And I think that, like, I'm this grief and loneliness now is, we need to articulate it and find words and language and shapes for the ways that our hands move by ourselves in front of a Zoom like, you know, more in front of web cameras, even more now as queer people, because I think the loss and deep grief of community is something that is going to have a political cost. And not saying that people aren't organizing on online spaces, that things are happening. This conversation is being streamed. It's gorgeous. There's ways in which we always find a way when we are pressed under a thumb, under a foot on our necks, boots on our necks. We always find a way. But I think that it's difficult to think about any kind, even more so now, of a singular community because of how fractured and lonely and COVIDized we all are now. And I feel so much grief in my body and my heart just watching queers dance to Kwaito on the screen. It's so sore. It's so sore.
I mean, on this idea of loneliness, is it possible to wonder about the possibilities that lie in the fact that, you know, it's individual, you know, it's articulated as at individual level, that, you know, I'm queer, I'm lonely, you know, is it possible to use that to connect to others? Is it possible for that to be what allows us to come together? Not in the sense that, you know, we're gonna come into one room, but I mean the idea of, oftentimes this idea of bonding around grief, right? I know there's danger in that, right? And a lot of us queer people do that we're violated, and that becomes what we use to identify others, that, oh, this is us, the ones who walk around with grief, the ones who walk around with unresolved issues, the ones who now it would seem even in the room that there's a collective recognition of that grief in relation to the state, and it brings us to engage the state and say, no, this is not right, and we are unhappy about it. And so my question is it possible to really grapple with that loneliness and the possibilities that lie there in terms of allowing connection and community?
So someone gave me a very strange compliment yesterday. It's not a I think we can judge together if it's a compliment or not. So we met at a party where the hosts of the party, they never met anyone there really before. So they meet the hosts. They're like, oh, that person I met, can I get in touch with them? And then they say, let's have a coffee. And they're like, oh, what I really like about the hosts of this party, I find them so kind, because like the way they welcomed you as a person, you're so weird, and they were okay with it. And I was like, what? Because I didn't realize that I was an acquired taste. I mean, and he was like, yeah, they're so kind for like acquiring it. And I was like, oh, wow. I think it's rude, right? But if someone says it to your face, then you have to kind of think it's like maybe it's like I say, so I don't know. I think I find there's so much of my own brain, my own anxieties and my own functioning in the world that I'm just trying to still accommodate, that I guess sometimes I'm a bit overly generous to people in terms of, oh, can you accommodate? Maybe that's a thing. I wonder, I don't know if group grief is always the only thing I want out of connection with another person. Like, it can be one thing, but can I just also be like petty with you sometimes? Or like the joy of coming here, I was like, oh my gosh, I've been sitting at home with this hair, I dyed red, and it's finally people who understand, because the people at my child's school are just like, what's happening with this child's mother? You know, I'm like, people who understand me, you know, like, that's not grief for me. This is not grieving. It's like, yeah, look, my hair looks nice, you know? I don't know. So I think our capacity to feel is so wide, and that I think that the ways that and I think because we tune out our own bodies for so long, we feel so unsafe in them for so long, that the ways that our bodies already know how to flourish or connect or, even heal from things, we don't even trust it enough to be like, and I think that incapacity to know that, because we're so used to narrative, like them narrativizing, we're used to talking and narrativizing and putting language to make something legible, that we're so mistrustful of so much of the other, things that, that I, like one of the things I used to love doing that I haven't done in a long time, when it was raining and there's mud and you just go play with your friends, like, maybe that's a thing to do, except for soil erosion. But I'm like, I think there's got to be somewhere where it's possible without eroding the soil. I mean, like, just like, and that, that aspect of, it's like, that was fun to do, but we don't have to see each other again tomorrow, But that was nice. I don't know. I don't know. Maybe, yeah.
One of my mentors, Minister Bangala, loves to say that grief and trauma are not cohesive. That we might be able to recognize each other, that it might be attractive, that we might be able to draw close to each other. But empathy does that. The grief doesn't do that. The trauma doesn't do that. And I've tried, and I'm sure many community organizers in the room might empathize with this as well, but when anger, maybe not anger, but when trauma is a thing that bonds you to another person, that there's a breakdown that's already seeded into the beginning. And I want so much more for us, because we deserve so much more.
I think my sense, at the end of this day, is that Maneo is quite optimistic.
Deeply.
and it's so evident.
Stubbornly so.
And yes, right? And the reason I'm asking these questions really is because even when you organize around experiences of bisexual people, you recognize that, we are excluded and all of that. But a lot of the times, in my experience, that has become the only thing I know to organize around. But I want other things. I want friendship, I want brotherhood. If it has to do with men, I want to experience joy and go play in the mud as well, without grief and trauma and violence being the center that holds us together. Now, I mean, even when we think of pride, the first thing really that has become clear today is that we need to rearticulate pride outside the new liberalized articulations where it's about relationships with corporates and cool branding, whatever that nonsense that people do. We need to politicize pride, right? So that's the first thing. But when you look at the theme of this engagement, it's pride beyond the silos. It's recognizing the loneliness that we exist, or I wouldn't say the loneliness, but the fact that we are individuals who might have similar experiences, but we want to rearticulate pride in such a way that our coming together is not centered around trauma, which is why I'm asking about trauma. Perhaps then there's a possibility to ask a question, and it's the last question really. What then becomes the alternative? Insofar as advancing this politicized pride, this coming together and being in commune with one another, what becomes the alternative outside trauma, outside the pain and the anger that we often, are drawn to one another by?
So I'm not an either or kind of person. So for me, I'm like, yeah, bring your empathy and your grief and your trauma and your sense of humor and even your little bit of petty, and even because all of us, we have the capability to be cruel because we learned the language from young. Bring your little bit of cruelty. I think because we're so, my body apparently has a language of its own that my brain does not speak. I wonder if we have not got lots to gain from multiple commitments or multiple orientations at the same time, and multiple commitments that keep alive at the heart of it that thing that the question with the sense our senses of justice, you know, and because it wouldn't be like, because then you have like trauma was the register, and from 2015 to 2019, and now it's joy. I mean, then there becomes these things, and I'm like, no man. Like I think that we need all of those intuitions, because they're all intuitions we possess, and that's probably also my againstness to progressive time, where we're then forced into one single issue struggle frames, because you know it's like this and this. I'm like, but these things are continuous, present continuous, and ongoing and enduring, and we haven't even begun to touch some aspects of it, but maybe we have. And I think that it should be more playful for me.
It's really nice to sit up on a stage with a poet, like another poet. And a lot of the answers of, like, when I feel as deeply lost and angry as I feel right now, is I kind of lean back into the deep mystery of and formalism of poetry, I guess. But also, like, and it's gonna sound weird, but like also horror movies are deeply comforting. And one of my favorite ones, and because you were talking about, okay, well, we need to repoliticize pride, but one of my favorite horror movies is The Shining. And yeah, thank you. Thank you, catch me, because I feel like a weirdo. Thanks for the hands that were like, yes. I'm like, yes, okay, I can talk now. One of my favorite scenes is Danny running away from his monstrous, awful father, who's now taken up by the spirits of the Overlook Hotel. And they're in this maze, this labyrinth, covered in snow. And he has a moment where he gets lost, but he now needs to both evade his father, but also get out of the maze. And the way he does it is by retracing his steps, by going backwards. And someone with a deep respect for history, but also a healthy skepticism, or like a cynicism around history as well, that it's not a god to worship to, but a room and a library to wonder within. That it's not that we need to anything. The tools are already there. It's just in looking back, retracing our steps, and making our way out. And one of my favorite poets, Danai Smith, likes to say, and quotes Ross Gahan, saying that in order for us to think about a life or a world without prisons, we must write about a world without prisons. That if we must think about a world without the state, we must imagine a world without the state. And the work of queer people is that we are myth makers by breathing. That we aren't supposed to be, and yet we are. So we are already from the future. So we are already enacting and creating the future. I'm getting romantic. Yes, you are. I love it. but I also need a blanket to kind of just to wrap me, because I'm so angry. I'm livid, I'm shaking. But how I remember and try to envision and try to steel myself for the work ahead is by these touch points. So retracing and making our way out, because we already have the tools.
Okay, so we're gonna have one round. It's the last one, and just 3 hands, and then we're done. And because we have to close now. It's just very short.
Just on the community question, I really struggle with communities because of 2 things: romance and dominance. And so the idea of community is a bit difficult for me to understand. One, because the world is so romantic. And on top of that, everyone who dominates is not a loving authority, you know, so communities are difficult to navigate because you can't find romantic people who are also loving authorities. And even when we build communities, we still don't submit to loving authorities. So it becomes, that's why I hate romance and optimism.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to close. If there's no question.
Thank you for holding space. Particularly right now, during this pandemic, I think. Do you want me to hold this? Sorry. I'm making. Boy, sorry. It's just, yeah, like, I don't think. For me, this is probably the first kind of more politicized queer space where it felt like we got somewhere. I mean, even with the deputy minister tripping, I don't think I have ever been in a queer space where we've been able to debrief violence that we have all experienced at the same time, where in big spaces where we walk outside and then it's at the coffee station where like suddenly we're breaking this down. But even you as the panelists to share that with us and to hold that space for us as the audience, it's rare, it's incredibly appreciated, and it's so queer. Like, just knowing that it needs to be horizontal, because we're not going to win if it's hierarchical. So thank you for holding the space and for just giving us that room to just debrief and to process it together, and together with you as the panelists. And the optimism, because that's also what that is, right? Is that getting to debrief means that there's hope. Because we could just give up and just quit. So thank you for holding it.
Thank you for being here. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Thank you.
Wait,
and thank you to the panelists. I can see.
Can
yes.
I just say something?
Yes.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. I think it's important for continue to have spaces and languages to, where we can play, right? I think Bev wants to say something before we close. Oh,
I wanted you to plug.
Can you plug it?
Okay. My latest film is on at the Bioscope.
Yep.
It's titled Lesbians Free Everyone, and it is 25 years of after the Beijing conference, and nobody really knows what happened at the Beijing conference, where we had the biggest lesbian visibility campaign in history. I'd like to use the word history because his story is the one that dominates and her story is invisible. And so we're on Sunday at the Bioscope at Stanley, It's 44 Stanley, and it's at 6 p.m. Please come watch. 70 rands, you can get tickets, and if you can't afford it, just talk to me, we'll make a plan. Please come check it out. That's it. Thank you, and thank you very much for this invitation, and thank you for this panel, and thank you, it's so beautiful. Thank you for everybody here. Yay, thank you.
Thank you. There's food outside, so yeah, be merry and engage.
Thank you very much, everyone.